March 8th, 1970. Ainsville, Florida. Don Garlits, the most feared name in drag racing, is sitting in his top-fuel dragster at the starting line. The engine fires, the clutch engages, and then the transmission explodes. Right beneath him, the car splits in half at 250 miles an hour. When the wreckage stops, Don Garlits looks down at his right foot. Half of it is gone. Most men, most racers, that would have been the end. The end of the career, the end of the dream. But Don Garlits wasn't most men, because exactly 1 year later, he showed up at the NHRA Winternationals in Pomona, California, with a car nobody had ever seen before, a car that broke every elapsed time record on the books, a car so revolutionary, so completely ahead of everything else on the planet that NHRA had to rewrite their entire rulebook before the next event. One man, one car, one run. And drag racing was never ever the same again. This is that story. Before we get to the explosion, before we get to the car that changed everything you need to understand who Don Garlits was, because this isn't just a story about engineering, it's a story about a man. Donald Glenn Garlits was born in Tampa, Florida in 1932. He didn't grow up around money. He didn't grow up around racing royalty or factory sponsorship or any of the advantages that the big teams had. He grew up around heat and humidity and a deep personal obsession with going fast. Tampa in the 1940s wasn't exactly a hotbed of motorsport culture, but young Don Garlits found engines the way some kids find music instinctively, completely, without anyone showing him the way. By his late teens, he was building hot rods in a garage that had no air conditioning and no sophisticated tooling, just hand tools, determination, and a mind that understood mechanical systems the way a musician understands rhythm. He started racing in the early 1950s, and from the very beginning, he was different. Not just fast, different. Where other racers were satisfied with incremental improvements, a little more carburation here, a little weight reduction there, Garlits was always asking a bigger question. Why does a drag car work the way it works? What is the fundamental engineering principle here? And is there a better way to do it? He named his cars Swamp Rat, a nod to his Florida roots, to the wet heat and the sawgrass and the particular kind of toughness that comes from building something in a place that doesn't make it easy. By the mid-1960s, Swamp Rat had become the most recognizable name in top-fuel drag racing. Don Garlits' Big Daddy, as the fans called him, was the man to beat. He had set records, won championships, made runs that made other drivers shake their heads. But he had also been hurt before, burned, crashed. Racing in the 1960s was not a safe occupation. Top-fuel dragsters of that era were essentially controlled explosions on wheels, nitromethane burning, fire-breathing machines that operated right at the edge of what materials and engineering could contain. Garlits knew the risk. Every driver did. They drove anyway, because that's who they were. And then came March of 1970. The NHRA Gatornationals, Gainesville Raceway, Florida. March 8th, 1970. It was a Sunday. Qualifying day. The kind of warm, bright Florida morning that makes you feel like nothing bad can happen. Don Garlits lined up his car Swamp Rat 13 at the starting line. The engine note was right. The track was prepped. Everything felt normal. He staged the car, got the signal, hit the throttle, and then the transmission let go. Not a small failure, not a crack or a leak. A catastrophic, violent, instantaneous explosion. The Lenco transmission sitting between Garlits' legs in the traditional front engine, dragster layout came apart with a force that sliced through the car's chassis like a blade. Swamp Rat 13 broke in half. The front section with Garlits in it went one way. The rear section with the engine still running, still on fire, went another. When the cars and pieces and fire came to rest, the track workers ran to Garlits. He was conscious. He was talking, but his right foot, his throttle foot, had been nearly severed, destroyed by the transmission fragments that had passed directly through the cockpit. He was rushed to the hospital. Surgeons worked to save what they could. In the end, the front portion of his right foot, the toes, and the ball of his foot could not be saved. Don Garlits, at 37 years old, at the height of his career, woke up in a hospital bed, missing part of his foot. Now, I want you to imagine something. You've spent your entire adult life building towards something. Racing is not just your job, it's your identity. your purpose, the thing that makes you more yourself than anything else. And in 1 second, one mechanical failure, it's taken from you. Or so everyone assumes. The press wrote the obituaries for his career. Not literally, but in effect. Big Daddy's done. Too badly hurt. Too old to come back. The sport will move on. The sport was wrong. Because lying in that hospital bed, Don Garlits wasn't thinking about retirement. He was thinking about the transmission. He was thinking about where the transmission sat on a conventional front-engine dragster, right between the driver's legs, right where the shrapnel goes when it fails. And he was thinking, what if the engine wasn't in the front? What if the engine wasn't in the front? What if the engine was in the back? Don Garlits spent months recovering from his injury. Surgery, rehabilitation, learning to walk again with a foot that was fundamentally changed. Most people in that situation, even strong people, even determined people, would have found reasons to stay home, to consult, to coach, to be involved in the sport in some safer, more distant way. Garlits went back to the garage, not to supervise, to build, because the idea that had come to him in the hospital, the rear engine concept, wouldn't leave him alone. And here's the thing you have to understand about why this idea was so radical. Every top-fueled dragster in America, every single one ran with the engine in the front. This wasn't just tradition, it was dogma. The conventional wisdom was ironclad. Front engine meant the heavy drivetrain components were over the drive wheels, which meant traction. The weight distribution of a front-engine dragster was fundamental to how it hooked up off the line. Rear-engine cars had been tried before, briefly, in the 1950s. They hadn't worked. They were unstable. They couldn't put the power down. They were abandoned. The racing community had reached a consensus. Rear-engine, top-fuel cars don't work. End of discussion. Except Don Garlits didn't believe in end of discussion. He believed in why. And when he sat down with his rebuilt foot in his Florida garage with a pad of paper and a mechanical pencil and started working through the actual engineering of why rear-engine cars had failed before, he started finding answers that the conventional wisdom had never bothered to look for. The 1950s attempts had failed because of tire technology, not because of the fundamental concept. The tires of that era couldn't manage the loading characteristics of a rear-engine car at the power levels involved. But it was 1970. Tire technology had advanced enormously. The 1950s attempts had failed because of suspension geometry. The cars hadn't been designed from the ground up as rear-engine machines, they'd been hasty conversions. Compromised from the start, Garlits wasn't going to make a conversion. He was going to design a completely new car, from first principles, for a rear engine from the very beginning. And there was one more thing, the safety argument. With the engine behind the driver, with the transmission behind the driver, if the drivetrain failed catastrophically, the shrapnel went backward, away from the cockpit, away from the driver. Don Garlits had paid with his foot to learn that lesson. He wasn't going to forget it. He named the new car Swamp Rat 14, and he built it to change everything. Let me tell you about Swamp Rat 14, because this car deserves a full description. Every detail of it matters. The chassis was designed from scratch. Chromoly steel tubing, lightweight, strong, laid out in a configuration that had never been used in top fuel before. The driver sat near the front of the car. Not over the front wheels exactly, but much further forward than on a conventional rear engine layout. This was deliberate. Garlits had calculated the weight distribution he needed. And he put the driver where the math said he needed to be. The engine, a supercharged nitromethane burning V8, the same basic power plant that every top fuel car used, sat behind the driver, between the driver's seat and the rear axle. The transmission, the clutch assembly, the entire drivetrain, all of it behind the cockpit. The aerodynamics were different in a way that turned out to be profoundly important. On a front-engine dragster, the driver sits behind a large, exposed engine and supercharger. The aerodynamic profile is chaotic, lots of drag, lots of lift, lots of turbulence around the cockpit. On Swamp Rat 14, the driver sat at the front of a clean, low nose. The aerodynamic profile was dramatically smoother. Less drag meant more speed for the same power. But here's what nobody expected, and what turned out to be the biggest surprise of the 1971 Winternationals. The weight distribution of the rear engine layout was actually better for traction than anyone had predicted. The old wisdom said front engine cars hooked better because the drivetrain weight was over the drive wheels. What that wisdom missed was that in a front engine car, the rear tires, the drive tires, were actually carrying relatively little weight at rest. The engine and transmission were way up front, loading the front wheels. In Garlits' rear engine layout, that heavy drivetrain was sitting right over the drive wheels, exactly where the traction needed it. And under acceleration, under the enormous longitudinal load transfer of a top fuel launch, the rear engine car's weight shifted to the rear even more decisively. The tires planted harder than any front engine car could manage. Garlits had solved a traction problem that the conventional layout had been fighting for 20 years, and he'd solved it by doing the thing everyone said couldn't be done. He tested the car in Florida through late 1970. The times were good, better than good. He brought it to Pomona, the 1971 Internationals race day, the NHRA Winternationals. Pomona, California, February 1971. This was the first major national event of the season, the opener, the race where the tone gets set for the entire year. When Don Garlits rolled Swamp Rat 14 into the pits, the reaction was immediate. People stopped. They walked over and stared because they had never seen anything like it. A top fuel dragster, a real, serious, purpose-built top fuel dragster with the engine sitting behind the cockpit. The other drivers looked at it with expressions that ranged from amused to genuinely confused. Some of them laughed. The conventional wisdom of the paddock was unanimous. This thing won't work. It can't work. We've been down this road before. Nice experiment, Big Daddy. Now where's your real car? The NHRA technical inspectors were curious, cautious, and ultimately confused about how to classify what they were looking at. It was legal. There was nothing in the rulebook that said the engine had to be in the front, because nobody had thought they needed to write that rule. Swamp Rat 14 passed tech, and then Garlits went out to qualify. The run he made, the elapsed time that came off the clocks at the end of that quarter mile, was 6.78 seconds. 6.78 seconds. The existing national record, set by a front-engine car, was 6.98 seconds. Don Garlits, in his first competitive run, in a design that everyone said was impossible, had gone 2 full tenths of a second faster than the national record. 2 tenths. In a sport measured in hundredths. That's not an improvement. That's a demolition. The paddock that had been laughing 20 minutes earlier went completely, totally silent. The drivers who had smiled at the weird-looking car from Florida were now standing at the timing tower, staring at the board. 6.78 seconds. Don Garlits backed it up, ran it again. The car was consistent. The car was fast. The car was real. And by the time the Winternationals were over with Garlits driving Swamp Rat 14 to victory, the entire top fuel world understood what had just happened. The front-engine dragster wasn't just challenged. It was finished. One man, one car, one weekend. 20 years of conventional wisdom gone. Now, let's talk about what happened next, because this is where the story gets fascinating on a different level. NHRA had a problem. A man had just shown up with a car that was so much faster than everything else. Not by a little, but by a massive margin that it threatened to make the entire top fuel class irrelevant. If every competitive team didn't immediately convert to rear-engine configurations, they simply wouldn't be competitive. The gap was too large to overcome through tuning or incremental improvement, which meant NHRA had a choice: ban the rear-engine configuration and protect the status quo, or acknowledge that the status quo was over and manage the transition. The political pressure to ban it was real. There were powerful team owners with enormous investments in front-engine cars who were furious. Men who had spent decades developing their front-engine programs, who had factories and sponsors tied to existing equipment, who were now looking at the possibility of their entire competitive program being obsolete. They made their case to NHRA loudly. But NHRA was also looking at another factor: safety. The carnage in top fuel racing from drivetrain explosions from exactly the kind of failure that had taken Garlits' foot was undeniable. Drivers had been killed and seriously injured by failures in the conventional layout. The rear engine configuration put all of that hardware behind the driver. It was fundamentally, demonstrably safer. You cannot, as a sanctioning body in 1971, with the awareness of driver safety growing in every form of motorsport, look at a safety improvement of that magnitude and ban it because it's inconvenient for the established teams. NHRA made the right call. They didn't ban the rear engine car. They rewrote the rules around it. Technical specifications for the rear engine layout were developed and codified. Safety requirements were updated to reflect the new configuration. Classes were restructured to manage the transition period. And then, in one of the most remarkable transformations in motorsport history, the entire top fuel field converted. Not over years, over months. Within one full season by the 1972 schedule, virtually every serious top fuel competitor had abandoned their front-engine cars and built or converted to rear-engine configurations. 20 years of front-engine development, millions of dollars in existing equipment, decades of accumulated knowledge about front-engine setup and tuning, gone in less than 12 months, because one man in a Florida garage had asked a better question. The last competitive front-engine top fuel car ran in national NHRA competition in 1972. Today, if you go to an NHRA national event, if you stand at the starting line and watch a top fuel dragster make a full power run, you are watching the direct descendant of Swamp Rat 14. Every single top fuel car on the planet runs a rear engine configuration. Every single one. Don Garlits didn't just win a race. He permanently and completely changed the form of the machine. I want to step back and talk about what this moment actually meant, because it's easy to tell the 1971 Winternationals story as a sports story. Underdog beats the odds. Revolutionary design wins the day. Rulebook gets rewritten. But there's something bigger here. Don Garlits' rear-engine car was a demonstration of a specific kind of American thinking that was, and I'd argue still is, the best version of what this country produces. It was the thinking of a man who had been told no by the accumulated consensus of his entire industry, and who responded by going back to first principles and asking why. Not how do I get a little faster within the existing framework, but is the framework itself wrong? That's a different question, a harder question, a question that requires you to be willing to look foolish in front of everyone you respect. When Garlits rolled that car into Pomona, when the other drivers were laughing, he was betting everything on the answer to that question. His reputation, his identity, the last reserves of his physical resilience after the explosion. He was 38 years old, missing part of his foot, sitting in a car that everyone in the sport had already dismissed, and he went 6.78 seconds. Think about the other side of that story for a moment. Think about every driver and crew chief who had spent years developing their front-engine program, who had dismissed the rear-engine concept because the conventional wisdom said it couldn't work. They were smart men, experienced men, men who knew drag racing as well as anyone alive, and they were wrong. Not because they were foolish, but because they were asking the question within the existing framework instead of questioning the framework itself. There is a lesson there that has nothing to do with drag racing, about the danger of consensus, about the importance of going back to first principles, even especially when everyone around you is certain the answer is already settled, and about what happens when a man who has already lost something precious decides that loss is going to mean something. Don Garlits lost part of his foot in March of 1970. He used that loss to build the most important race car in the history of drag racing. That's not a sports story. That's an American story. The man behind the legend, Don Garlits, kept racing. That might seem obvious given everything we've talked about, but it's worth saying plainly. After 1971, after Swamp Rat 14, he didn't retire to a legacy. He kept competing, kept developing, kept pushing. He won 3 NHRA Top Fuel Championships, set multiple national records across different decades of the sport, Competed at the national level into the 1990s, a career spanning more than 4 decades of active racing. He was still making competitive runs in exhibition events well into the 2000s. He built the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing in Ocala, Florida, which houses not just his own cars, but one of the most comprehensive collections of racing history in America. If you've never been and you love this sport, it belongs on your list. Every Swamp Rat car, including Swamp Rat 14, is there. You can walk up to it, stand next to it. Look at the cockpit where Don Garlits sat on February 1971 and made the run that broke the record and broke the rulebook. It's smaller than you expect. They always are. The machines that change history are always somehow smaller than the stories they generate. But the story is real. The times are real. The rulebook that had to be rewritten, that's real. And the man, now in his early 90s, Don Garlits, is still alive, still sharp, still connected to the sport he spent his life transforming. He has been asked thousands of times about 1971, about Pomona, about what it felt like to make that run. His answers are always modest, matter of fact. The way men of his generation tended to talk about the things they were most proud of sideways, understated, like it was just the logical next step. I knew the car was right, he has said. I just had to show them. I just had to show them. 6 words, 60 years of drag racing history. That is the story of Don Garlits and Swamp Rat 14. The car that showed up at Pomona with half a foot and a completely new idea and left with a national record, a Winternationals trophy, and a permanent place in American motorsport history. The car that made NHRA pick up their rulebook, look at it, and start writing new pages before the season was even over. The car that every top-fuel dragster alive today descends from. If you were at Pomona that weekend in February 1971, or if you heard about it and remember where you were when the news came through, I want to know. Drop it in the comments. Tell me your memory of Big Daddy. Tell me about the first time you saw a rear-engine top-fuel car run in person. Those stories are history too, and they deserve to be heard. If this video gave you something, hit the subscribe button. We've got a lot more of this coming. Next week, we're going inside the Sox and Martin Pro stock program. The car that Chrysler officially had nothing to do with. The dyno room that technically didn't exist. And the times that shouldn't have been possible. You're not going to want to miss that one. Until then, Big Daddy said it best. I just had to show them. See you next week.